G'day and welcome to another gun related video on my channel. Now this is this old German Rook rifle that I did a video about a little while ago, and if you watch that video you'll see that when I got this rifle there's no markings. I didn't know where it was from or anything about it. I was able to determine that it was German based on its proof marks, and I was also able to determine a little bit about its chambering and bore size based on the proof marks, or the marks that were associated with the proof marks on the gun. So I got thinking, well maybe, and that got me thinking, maybe proof marks would be a good subject for me just to do a short, fairly brief video on. If you're really interested in proof marks, Ian McCollum on Forgotten Weapons has a, I think it's about 3-hour video where he presents a seminar at some law enforcement conference, and he goes through proof and general gun marks in complete detail. So if you're really interested, that's worth watching. But if you just wanted just a general overview of what are proof marks and how can they maybe be used by you to be a benefit as far as your the guns that you have, well, I'll try to put that sort of information in this one without making it too long. Alright, so we'll just put that to the side for a minute. Now, if you're into old guns and you're getting a lot of old guns and you want a reference as far as looking for proof marks, this is the basic standard reference. It's pretty much the only real reference that I can find. The Standard Directory of Proof Marks is written by a German, and this is actually an English translation of it. It's available from Blacksmith Publishers. It's readily available. You get it on Amazon, eBay, gun shops, gun book places. So it's well worth buying if you're likely to be coming across old guns and you need to look up information. Now there is a lot of information on the net as far as proof marks and general marks. So just doing general searches, you will find a bit of stuff. The British proof houses have websites which actually show some, and there are other websites. But this book is basically broken down into an introduction to proof marks, what they are, and then A to Z, all the different main countries, mainly in Europe. In fact, they're all in Europe. Now, we'll have a look at this magazine. Now, just recently I was doing a bit of a clean-up and I came across this magazine amongst all my books and magazines. This is the, where is it? Here we go, May June 2018 issue of New Zealand Guns and Hunting magazine. Back here so it's in focus. It's a really good magazine. Unfortunately, it's now defunct. They went to online a couple of years ago, but now they've closed down. But I was a semi-regular contributor to this magazine for many years, and I've got an article in this magazine about proof marks, generally just a general introduction to proof marks. Now, let's see if I can find this article. Here we go, page 48. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically just present this article to you as a video, and then as you can see there's a whole heap of photos in here. I should have all those photos on my computer so I can actually also show you the photos, and we can do some demonstrations or examples of it. If you want to be picky, the term proof mark is actually just the marks that are put on the gun when it undergoes proof, which if you don't know what that means, I'll be talking about that in a minute. But generally people talk about proof marks as all those marks that are put on the gun at the proof house. Not the marks that the maker puts on them, Winchester Firearms Company, not that, but they're little marks that are put on them at the proof house. But other information that's put on there, they can be quite valuable to the owners, later owners of the guns. So the practice of gun proving goes back to the very early days of firearm manufacture in Europe. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but in the very early days when they were making muzzle-loading rifle and shotgun barrels, they started off with just flat pieces of steel that had been rolled from the steel mill, and the barrel maker would heat them up in a furnace or what they called a forge, heat them up to red hot, and then they'd be put around a big steel round mandrel and then bent around the mandrel like that, so that in effect you then had a seam along one side. And then what they would do is they'd heat the barrel over the mandrel a bit at a time, and then they'd bring it out and they'd put it on an anvil, and they'd have a couple of guys with big hammers, and they'd hammer weld. So by hammering the edge, where the edge of the rolled over steel goes, it would actually weld it together just by the process of hammering the red hot steel, and they'd weld it together. And they do that a bit at a time down the whole length of the barrel. I've seen them do that. I was over in America, and I went to a old-fashioned barrel maker who was actually demonstrating how to do this. Now, that seam in the barrel would always be a weak spot. It's never going to be as strong as the rest of the barrel, but with the pressure generated by black powder, if it was done properly, it would be adequate, and the barrel would last a lifetime. However, if there was weaknesses in that weld, they didn't have X-ray and all that back then, there was no way of actually knowing. So what they would do, once that process was finished, before they spent any more time on the barrel, they used to thread the end, put a breech plug in it, and they put a proving charge in it. So they put a big charge of black powder, and they just put it under a couple of sandbags or something with a fuse, and they would light it and let it fire. And if there was a weakness in that weld, well, it would explode straight away, and so then that barrel would be scrapped. So the good thing about that was they wouldn't spend any more time working on that barrel only to have it fail, either improving or, you know, by a buyer later on. So that was the initial way that proving was done. And then of course, so they'd prove the gun, and then if it survived the proof, then they would continue building it. But initially there was just the small gun makers or barrel makers. It might have been a gun maker that made all these parts, like in America and these Pennsylvania gun makers in Lancaster County and all that. They used to make the whole thing. They'd make the barrel, make the lock, make everything. So they'd spend probably a week making a barrel, and then they'd prove it before they continued on making the gun. And you know, they might take 2 months or something to make a gun, and so they were, you know, in the standards of the day, they were very valuable items because they took so long to make. Now, in 1501, the Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg, which is now Austria, part of Austria, decreed that a central proof house be established to prove all the firearms in the kingdom. So instead of all these little gun makers doing their own proving, and you know, the buyer had to trust that that gun maker did the right thing in proving the gun, so you weren't going to buy a gun and take it out and find that it explodes, you know, later on. This is the first time the government was actually saying, right, we need a proof house and every gun has to be proved. Then in 1637, England did the same thing. They formed the Worshipful Company of Gunmakers. Now that's still in existence today. It's still called the same thing, although it's more commonly called the London Proof House now. In 1672, Liège in Belgium, which of course has always been a big gun making area, they also followed suit and formed their own proof house. And then over the next period of time, most of the other major European powders, especially as the Industrial Revolution increased and firearms manufacture became more of a small workshop, one guy kind of thing, into a factory type of thing, almost all the European countries actually established proof houses. Although some of them weren't mandated, some of them it was optional. The gun maker could actually send the gun off to the proof house, and it was probably in their interest to, if they were making a gun, send it off, get it proved, so they get it back and finish it, so they can say to the customer, righto, this has been proved by the central gun proof house, and the customer was confident that they were buying a quality and safe firearm. Now, most of these European proof houses are still operating today. So common ones that you hear about, there's Ibar in the Basque gun making area in Spain. There's Saint Etienne in France, Gardone in Italy, and of course the London proof house that we already discussed. In 1813 in England, a second British proof house was established in Birmingham, because Birmingham had actually become by that stage a major gun making centre. And so instead of having to ship everything to London and then ship them all back to Birmingham again, where the majority of the guns were being made, they established the Birmingham Proof House. So I think the London Proof House concentrated on those sort of high-end London gun makers, and most of the industrial gun makers who were based in Birmingham went through the Birmingham Proof House. Now, the world's largest firearms manufacturer, probably from the mid-19th century, of course, is the USA, but surprisingly they never had a centrally mandated proof house. Each company did its own firearms proving, so it was up to them to make sure that their products were safe. Most of them had their own, the big ones had their own proof house, own in-house proof house. I know that I've got a few Winchester Rifles, and they'll have a WP symbol in an oval. That was the Winchester Proof Mark that was stamped on the rifles after they'd been proved, or rifles and shotguns, I guess. But unfortunately, that means that you can't really get a lot of information generally about American firearms, old American firearms, from their marks, because they don't really tell you too much. I mean, you can sometimes, if the maker kept records, you can work out when they were made from the serial number, but that's pretty much about it. That and just general features of the rifle or the firearm will often, give an indication of when it was made. Now, the proving process today is basically the same in all the proof houses. So what happens is the firearm comes in, and initially it has a manual, visual inspection and mechanical inspection, just to identify any obvious safety issues. I mean, if it doesn't work properly, or if there's some obvious safety issue with the firearm, well, then the proof house won't go any further in the proofing process. So, and often, depending on the proof house and what their stamps are, often that initial inspection, they call it a view mark. Like in the British guns, it'll be a V with a crown over it. So that's just to show that it's actually been accepted into the proof house and been viewed and found in general physical condition, it passes. So then what happens is one or two cartridges with a mandated load, which is typically 25 to 30% more than the standard load that's used in the firearm. They're fired in the firearm, so it's actually producing a lot higher pressure than it normally would in normal service. And then after that's done, and that's obviously done in a safe manner, they're in a special room with blast-proof glass, and they have a string and set up on a rest or a clamp, and then they're fired with a string, so if the gun explodes, there's no one who's going to get injured. And then after it's fired, the gun's examined to look for any obvious signs of failure, expanding barrel or anything like that. There's probably other inspections I think they do. Sometimes they might actually measure the barrels, like measure the diameter of the barrel before and after proving. They might check the head space, depending on what sort of firearm it is. But once they pass that test, they're then stamped with what's called the definitive proof mark. So depending on the proof house, that mark varies. We'll talk about that a bit later. They're stamped with a proof to show that they're in proof, so that they're actually safe to be used, and legally in those countries where they require proof to be sold, they're legally able to be sold. Now, the proof marks are generally put on the barrel, depending on the sort of firearm it is, of course. they're generally put on all pressure bearing parts. So the barrel typically over the chamber or just in front of the chamber. The receiver, the bolt, in a revolver, the cylinder. Yeah, in the case of a single shot with a breech block, you know, so falling block or whatever, they'll put a proof mark on the block because it's a pressure bearing part. Now, in 1914, the Permanent International Commission for Proof of Small Arms, which I think it's based in probably in Belgium, I think, and so it's actually, that is actually written in French and it's abbreviated to CIP. So you'll often see in a box of ammunition or various European shooting related things, it'll have CIP, which means that it's been approved by this Permanent International Commission for the Proof of Small Arms. So this commission was formed in 1914 so that countries could then recognise the proof supplied by other nations. So it was like a reciprocity sort of thing. So if the countries signed up to this CIP, it meant that if a gun was proofed in Germany, for example, and then someone brought it to France, well, it was legal to be sold in France because it had a German proof, and that was actually accepted, for example. So most of the European gun-making countries joined in. Now, but in the UK, the rules of proof, the first rules of proof were introduced in 1868, and they mandated that all firearms, regardless of whether they've got a foreign proof or not, had to have a British proof if they were to be sold in Britain. And so when 1914 came along and the CIP was formed, the United Kingdom refused to join. They said, no, we want to continue using the same rules where every firearm that comes into the UK must have British proofs. And that's why you'll often see, if you see guns that have been to Britain, and then, you know, even if they came from somewhere else, they'll always have British proofs on them. I've got a few examples of that. One that you might be interested in is a few videos back I did a review of the Savage Model 5, which is the Savage 22 bolt action rifle, and the one that I've got actually has a full set of Birmingham Proofs. In 1980, finally the UK agreed to join the CIP, and so this requirement for foreign proof firearms to be reproved in the UK was dropped. Now, the whole book's dedicated to deciphering proof marks, and in this article I'm only really going to scratch the surface. Get it? And the other thing I should mention is most of what I'm talking about is talking about sporting firearms. Generally military firearms, the actual armoury, the government armoury where the military firearms are made, will typically have their own proof house, and they'll be proved there and often have military proofs put on them. So so if you've got military guns, you know, it's a different set of proof marks you're going to be looking at. Alright, so going back to what we were talking about before and the way they proof a gun. A common type of gun that you look at is old British shotguns, you know, because there's plenty of them around, and you often come across old ones and you look at the proof marks to try to work out a bit about them. So you really need to understand how the British proof worked when it came to shotguns. And I'm going to give some examples later on, so we'll have a look at some examples, but we'll just talk about it for now. So in Britain, the gun maker got the tubes for the shotgun barrel. Some gun makers would have their own barrel making house and they'd make the tubes. Others would buy the barrels, you know, from a professional barrel maker who just makes plain shotgun tubes, and then the gun makers buy the tubes and then fit them into shotguns. And so what the gun makers used to do was, very roughly, they'd fit the breech to the tubes, but they wouldn't finish them, and they just make them so that they could actually withstand a load. So then the barrels go back to the gun maker, and he completes the gun. The first gun we're going to look at is a Claiborne and Johnson double barrel English hammer gun. Now this is the barrel flats. So let's look at all these marks that are on here. So the first ones, we'll start at this end. The first ones to look at are these two marks. You see it's a little kind of thing with a crown on it. Now that is a Birmingham proof mark for a barrel. So as I discussed before, the barrels are proofed individually to make sure that they're suitable for building a gun. So that would have been done, and those marks were marked on the barrel at that point. So let's go along here and let's look at these diamonds first. You'll see there's a 12 with a C in both barrels, and that just indicates 12 gauge cartridge gun. Generally, if it's in a diamond like this, it's a cartridge gun. At this point we can look at this one. Now this one says choke. You can see there's nothing here. So what that indicates is that this left barrel has a degree of choke and the right barrel has no choke. Now this in itself can help date a gun because chokes were only introduced, I'd have to actually look it up, I'll put it on the screen, about 1890 I think, something like that. So that means that this gun must have been made after chokes were introduced. And you'll note that there's nothing to indicate the amount of choke. That will come later in proofs. So then when we go over here, first of all, well, let's just forget about these proof marks here. Let's look at these two here. So you see that one says 13 and 13 on 1. I'm not sure what the 1 means, to be honest, but basically 13 means that the actual bore size of the barrels is within the range for a 13 bore. And that's not uncommon with these English guns. They might be nominally a 12 bore and take 12 bore cartridges, but the bore sizes are actually divided into ranges of diameter. When they've measured the bore of this gun, it's actually become within the range for a 13 bore. So that's what that means. And what that means is if the bores are ever honed out, if the gun goes to the proof house again, they can actually tell whether the bores have been honed out, and because if they say that the ranges are now in the 12 bore size, that they'll know. And then now these are all Birmingham proof marks. You can see by the BP and BV, and this proof here is a little bit different between Birmingham and London. But so this is the view proof. So this is the one that they put on when they first look at the gun, when it's accepted into the proof house, and it's given a general safety test. And then after the proving process with the overpowered cartridges, they're marked with the definitive Birmingham proof. Now you'll notice nowhere on this gun do we have an NP, BNP. In Birmingham it would be BNP with a crown on, would indicate nitro proof. Nowhere is this shown, so this is a black powder proof only gun and should only be fired with black powder cartridge. You have the breech flats of the same gun. So here, this is the C&J Claiborne Johnson maker's mark. So that just tells you who made it. And we've got our view proofs on here. They don't. It looks like they don't put the definitive proofs on. It's really only the barrels that are proved. This is the serial number, and this 1005 with the 2 dots I think is probably the inspector's number, so we know who actually did the proving. This is another English double gun, Charles Boswell. It's a much higher grade gun than the other one, but this one's been proofed at the London Proof House, and at about the same time, within the same rules of proof, because they did change over time. Again, we've got our provisional proofs on the barrels, a slightly different proof mark to the Birmingham ones, but the same concept. Both barrels are choked in this gun compared to the other one, and although we still don't have the actual degree of choke marked on here, we've got our 12 gauge cartridge marks. Now I've actually just, since I did that other one, I just had a bit of a look at this one, at this particular mark. When you have 12 with a simple C, that means it's a standard cartridge of that type, so 12 gauge. So at this time it would have been 2.5 inch cartridges. Now they did have 3 inch cartridges at that time. They would have been big goose type guns, and those actually have LC. I guess it stands for long cartridges, so it'll be 12 with LC, and if you see that, you know at this time it's going to be for 3-inch cartridges. Again, this gun has bore diameters that are within the range of 13 bore. We've got our view marks, but from the London Proof House they don't have the B on them, so it's just V with a crown. And then these two are our definitive proof marks. It actually is a stylized GP with a crown. So that's the London Proof House definitive proof mark. Here we have the barrels of a early gun. Now this is the rules of proof from 1868 to 1875. Now you'll notice that all these proofs are actually on the barrels themselves rather than the flats. This is actually, you can see the action here, so the flats are back in here. So they've put all the proofs actually on the barrels themselves in these early rules. So here we have a provisional London proof mark for the 2 tubes. Now apparently this is actually a rampant lion with a crown. You've got to use your imagination. But these are London proof marks. We've got the view proof. Now these tubes are 13 bore. Measured 9 inches back from the muzzle, and then we've got a London definitive proof. Now here's a gun from a similar period, so under the same rules of proof as that last one that I showed you. This one actually belongs to me. This is a very early hammer gun. It's got a wedge retained forend like an old muzzleloader used to have, and it's also got non-rebounding hammers, so it's a very early gun, so it's probably maybe late 1860s, early 1870s vintage. Now unlike the other one, these are actually Birmingham Proofs. So we've got our provisional proofs for the barrels here. As you can see, it's a slightly different design to the London ones. Then we have these proofs here. Now I think these, even though they look similar, I think they're slightly different. So one set of these is actually I think probably these here are probably the view proof marks, and then we've got the definitive proof marks. And this one actually has even smaller bores. The bores on this one, even though this is a 12 gauge gun, the bore diameter is within the range of 14 bore. Now this time I'm going to show you the flats of this. This is the same gun as I just showed you. As I said with that previous gun, in the early rules of proofs, 1868 to 1875, they put the proof marks actually on the barrels ahead of the flats. But these are the flats of that same gun. Now let's have a look. There's a heap of marks on here as well. So let's start here. We've got a big R on both barrels of the crown. So what that means is that the gun has been reproved. So it's been proved a second time. So once you know that, then you can come over and look at these. 18.2 is the diameter of the bores. They're both the same. This is before chokes were developed, obviously. And we've got BNP. Now that's Birmingham Nitro Proof. That's a definitive proof mark that this gun has been reproved using smokeless powder. Now it's been reproved to 850 bar. So these are modern. This is actually modern rules of proof. This was done in the last, probably 20 years. So it's been reproved. It actually they now give you a chamber instead of just saying it's a 12 gauge cartridge. It's 12 by 65, so it's 12 gauge, but they're actually telling you it's 65 millimeter chambers, which is the old 2.5 inch chambers. And then this one up here, which I think is probably the view proof for the second, when it's been reproved. I think this is the view proof before they do the nitro, the definitive nitro proof. So even though this is the older shotgun I've got, it's actually safe to shoot with mild. I mean, you don't want to use anything too heavy, but standard mild 2.5 inch 12 gauge cartridges, which you can buy yearly ones, just trap loads, are actually safe to shoot in this gun. And that's despite the fact that it's obviously clearly got Damascus type barrels just goes to show, you know, this whole thing about Damascus barrels are weak is just not true. As long as it's been proved correctly, this gun, when they proved it, they would have got it into before they did the nitro proof, they would have measured the thickness of the barrels, they would have looked closely at the barrels, looked for corrosion, looked for any reason why it wouldn't be safe to be nitro proved, and then they've gone ahead and proved it with nitro loads. Here we have another double gun. Now this one is slightly later. This is the rules of proof from 1896 to 1906, I think it is. And as you can see, there's some slight differences. So again, we've got, can't really see, I don't know if you can see there, it's actually got the choke is actually written on the barrels now as well as on the flats. I can't actually see, there would be a definitive proof mark on here. I don't know whether it's just not visible or whether it's further up the barrels, but actually I think that might be it just there. Anyway, these tubes would have the provisional proof on them. Now again, we've got the choke written on here without any indication of how much choke. We've got our cartridge thing just the same, although this is, as you can see, this is a 28 gauge gun. We've got London proof marks. We've got our view proof as normal. We've got our definitive proof as normal, as you've already seen. See, we've got 25, so the bore size of this, it's actually apparently measured 9 inches back from the muzzle, I just read. So this is in the 25 bore range. And then, but then we've got these extra proofs here. So these are nitro proof marks from the London Proof House. And we've also got a load. Now at this point they've actually decided that they need to provide a load. So this is nitro proved for a 3/4 ounce maximum load. And that's a standard velocity and pressure load. Alright, so let's go over to the continent now. This is a Spanish gun we're looking at. So we might as well just start at the left and move right. So we've got 18.2 on both of these. Now that's actually the bore size. I'm not sure the exact time, probably up near the muzzle, like 9 inches back from the muzzle or something like that. I'm not sure what this little mark is here, whether that's a relevant mark or it may even be an inspector's mark, although I think this is probably the inspector's name here, EM. Then we've got 18.4, so that is the bore diameter probably back in front of the chambers, I think. So it's slightly bigger. And you notice we've got CH on both of these. So that's choke, so it's choked. And then we've got 3 stars here. Now I'm not sure what that stands for, whether it's something to do with the chokes. The chokes on this gun are both full and both pretty much full choke, one slightly fuller than the other. So I initially thought these might be choke marks, but you'd expect there to be, see there seems to be 1 up here and 3 down here. But the choke, I thought initially it may be like, you know, open choke and then full choke, but it's not the case. So I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway, if we go back onto the flats, we have the serial number here. We've got 1270 in a triangle, so that's going back to that same, or in a diamond, sorry. Going back to that same thing in the old British guns, but at least here they're giving us the actual cartridge length, and it's got 900 kilograms. And then actually, I think there's actually, I don't think you can actually read it, but there's like a little square and it says centimeters over here. So it's 900 kilograms per square centimeter. So that's the pressure that's proved to. The other thing you'll see up here is got APM. Now this gun, the only mark it's got on the outside of it, it says Mendel, M-I-E-N-D-L, which is what it was. It's actually registered as that being the maker. But this APM, you doing a bit of a internet search, I found that APM is actually Armas Parcami, which is a Spanish gun maker from back in the kind of 60s and 70s, who made these, and they actually did make quite a lot of cheaper sidelock guns. So this mark alone actually told me who, you know, what actual maker this gun is. I had no clue before that. So we've got the 3 actual proof marks of these 3 here. So you'll see these 3 on pretty much every Spanish gun, modern Spanish gun. So this knight with the shield is the eye-bar proof house one. So I think that's like a what we call, what would be a view proof in the British guns. It means it's come into the proof house and been looked at. And then we've got a crossed rifles with a 2. That is actually the definitive proof mark to say that it's been proved. And then we've got this little shield looking thing with BP. Now that is actually a shotgun proof mark, so you'll only see that one on shotguns. And it is, hang on, I'll just find it in the book for you. It's an optional smokeless powder proof of shotgun barrels with a proof pressure of 12,090 psi. So that's basically a modern shotgun proof mark. If you had another sort of gun like a revolver, for example, it would probably still have this eye-bar proof mark. It would still have the cross definitive proof, but then it would have a special mark for the special type of gun it is. Now another mark we've got here is, it says 1450 GMOS. So that's 1450 gramos, I think. 1450 grams. And what that is that's actually the weight of the barrels. This is what a lot of the European proof houses do. They actually weigh the barrels and it's marked on there. So that means that if someone in the future gets in and polishes the outside of the barrels or hones the inside and takes material off them, which obviously makes the walls thicker, and they go back for proving, they can weigh the barrels and they'll know whether any material has been taken off. So whereas the British tend to measure the wall thickness and the bore sizes, the Spanish do the weight of the barrels. Now another important mark on this gun is this R. So there's a little tiny circle like a little dot, R1. Now this is actually a date code. Like most European guns actually had date codes on them, so we can look up it's quite easy to find online. There's tables. Alright, so if we search through here, go down here we go, R1 1973. That tells me that that's when this gun was made. So there's another piece of important information that I could get from the marks. This is a view of the area under the chamber in a commercial Obendorf Mauser made early in the 20th century. So we've been looking at shotguns, so this is an opportunity to look at a rifle mark. Now we see this B with the crown, U with the crown. They're present on old German firearms. One of them is the I'll have to check actually. I think the U is the view proof and the B is the definitive proof. So there's a whole heap going on here, some of which I know what it is and some I don't. Now this being a rifle and being early in the 20th century, we have to know what cartridge it's chambered for. Now we've got 7.85 here, which is probably a bore size mark. One of the important marks on this one is this one that says 156.14. The Germans, unusually in their rifles, actually used a bore sizing system where it was the same as gauges or bore size in British firearms, but they would actually mark, even in rifles, this is the actual bore, not the groove size, but the bore size in standard bore sizing, so it's 156.14 balls to the pound. So you can find tables of these and it will actually tell you. So this equates to basically 7.92, and in a rifle like this, a sporting rifle like this at that time, you'd pretty much be assured that it's going to be an 8mm Mauser, 8x57, but it's not definite, so you would probably be in your best interest, if you got a rifle of this and you weren't sure, to actually do a chamber cast and check. Now the other thing at that time, of course, is the cartridges changed from round nose to Spitzer cartridges late in the 19th century, so I think this S is probably, the military rifles used to have an S on over the chamber to show that they'd been re-chambered or re-barreled to suit Spitzer cartridges, so I think this is probably suits that. As for these others, BS is probably the inspector's initials, I think. these other marks I'm not sure of. Alright, so this is an example I've got, the only example I've got of some Italian proof marks. This is a Pieta brass frame Colt Navy revolver, 1851 Navy. So this first stamp here is BI, that's actually a date stamp, you can actually look it up, readily available on the net, the date tables for Italian guns, and this corresponds to 1997. This one here is a black powder proof. PN stands for Polvere Nero, which means black powder. So this is a black powder proof. Now this one here is actually the proof house proof, or I suppose it's like the view mark or acceptance mark into the proof house. There's two types. This one, which has the knight with the crossed rifles, this is Gardone, and if a similar looking one that has like a rampant lion in the middle is actually the Brescia proof house. Alright, so we've got to look at a smokeless gun from Italy as well. This is actually a shotgun. These are the barrel flats. So again, we've got a date code CA. So if you look up the date code chart, that's 2006. We've got our caliber up here, 20 gauge, 70mm. We've got the maker's name, Rizzini. It's a Rizzini shotgun. We got the serial number. I'm not sure what these letters, probably one of them is probably the inspector, I'd say. Now here, instead of having the PN that we saw on the black powder gun, we got PSF, and this is Polvere, whatever SF is, that's obviously Italian for smokeless powder. So that's a smokeless powder proof mark. And again, we've got this little thing, actually I said in the last one it was a knight, it wasn't. In the early guns, prior to when Italy was still a kingdom, you had a crown on the top here, and then it changed to a star back, well, I don't know, back before the Second World War, I think. We got the cross rifle, so again this is the Cardone proof house. The Belgians were prolific makers of guns, of course, so you'll probably come across a lot of old guns with Belgian proof marks. Now it's quite easy to tell a gun's Belgian. See this big circle with the crown and ELG? That's the mark of the Liège proof house, and that hasn't really changed. I've seen it on shotguns and revolvers going right back to the middle of the 19th century. Another mark that you'll see on a lot of these guns is this here. It's actually on its side here, but it's called the Peren Mark. It's actually like a little plinth with a tower on it. And this is a black powder proof that's put on all guns. Even if they're going to be subsequently proved with smokeless powder, they first do a black powder proof and they put this stamp on it. Now, just like with the Spanish gun, they've weighed these barrels. They're 1.684 kilos, so they can tell, you know, whether they've had any metal removed. Now, this is actually, even though this looks like a shotgun, this is actually the barrels from a double rifle. So that R with a crown indicates it's a rifled barrel. Now, I haven't been able to find in my directory of proof marks, it doesn't actually have anything about this T or these other marks. I'm not sure what that is. But I think this PV is actually a smokeless powder proof. Again, the book doesn't really have a lot of information about all these marks. But so yeah, I'm a bit vague with some of this. But you can look at a gun and at least know that it's Belgian, and probably know whether it's nitro proofed. This is the Savage Model 522 rifle that I mentioned earlier that has a full set of Birmingham proof marks on it. If you look on the receiver there for a start, you've got a circle with a crown on it, BP, not English make. Then if we look on the barrel, we've got circles with BV, we've got a circle with BP, we got a circle with NP, 0.22 LR, not English make. Now those are Birmingham proof marks from Birmingham in the UK, and they follow the 1925 rules of proof, where foreign firearms have to have their proof for a start. All their proof marks are within a circle, and it has not English make. Now early on the not English make was actually in a big square, and from 1925 on, but then at some stage later on, I'm not quite sure when, they got rid of that square and they just had not English make. and then that finished in this type of mark, not English make, finished in 55. I believe that it's most likely the reason that this rifle is proofed is because it was actually part of the Lend-Lease program, because Savage Model 5s were actually listed as being on the Lend-Lease programs, which means that they were given as military aid to the British, or theoretically lent as British military aid to the British in about 1942, I think, before the Americans entered the war. And of course every firearm that enters the UK has to actually be proofed. And I have actually found some photos on the net of actual rifles that actually went on the Lend-Lease program and came back to the UK, mainly Mossberg 42Ms, I think they're called, that had all these same proof marks. And the age of the rifle, this rifle was made between 1937 and 1946, which sort of fits with, you know, the fact that the American government probably bought these rifles new and then shipped them off to the UK. Well, that's probably enough examples for you. What you should do now is, if you've got any older guns especially in your collection, pull them out, have a look at the proof marks, and then just have a look online. You'll find plenty of information, and see if you can discover some things about your own guns that you didn't know. It was interesting, yesterday I was at the local shotgun club doing some filming for an upcoming shotgun episode, and there was a chap there with a Victor Sarasqueta Spanish sidelock gun, very similar to my Spanish sidelock, and I commented on it to him, and he said, "Oh yeah, this is made in 1945." And I kind of went, "Oh, what makes you think that?" "Oh, the guy got it from, someone told him that." So I said, "Oh, do you mind if I look at the proof mark?" So we pulled the fore end off, I had a look at the barrel, and I found the proof marks. I found the year proof, R1, pulled out my iPhone, quickly found a chart of Spanish proof mark codes, and said to him, "Here we go, R1, your gun was made in 1973. Took me about 3 minutes to get that information. And he was quite happy with that. He said, "Oh, thanks for that. I didn't know how to do that." And so now he knew a bit more about his gun than he did before. So anyway, that's about it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something. And until next time, thanks for watching.